Welcome to the channel, where we explore the most powerful moments in history, the mysteries of the universe, and the depth of human thought, all in a relaxing, immersive way designed to help you fall asleep or unwind. If you enjoy this kind of content, I'd be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more curious minds like yours. And before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below and let's create a quiet, thoughtful community together. Now, let's begin. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first journey back to a time before the war even began, to the roots of colonialism, nationalism, and geopolitical tension that would one day erupt into one of the most controversial and devastating conflicts of the 20th century. The story begins in the 19th century, when Vietnam was part of a much larger region known to Europeans as French Indochina. It included what we now know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In the late 1800s, the French established control over this region through a combination of military conquest and treaties with local rulers. Vietnam, with its rich culture and long history of resisting invaders, was not easily subdued. But over time, colonial rule was imposed, disrupting centuries of traditional governance, culture, and land ownership. The French exploited the region's resources, its rice fields, rubber plantations, and mineral wealth, while reshaping society in their own image. French became the language of power. Catholicism was promoted. Vietnamese laborers toiled under harsh conditions for the benefit of colonial overseers. Resentment simmered for decades, as did a longing for independence. By the early 20th century, resistance movements began to form. Some were rooted in nationalism, others in communism or religious revivalism. One of the most influential figures to emerge from this ferment was a young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, who would later take the name Ho Chi Minh. He traveled widely, working as a cook, a school teacher, and a journalist, while absorbing the revolutionary ideas sweeping Europe and Asia. In the 1920s and 30s, he became a leading voice in the Vietnamese independence movement, advocating for a Marxist-Leninist approach. World War II brought major changes. When Nazi Germany conquered France in 1940, the French colonial government in Indochina fell under the control of the Vichy regime, a puppet state collaborating with the Nazis. Meanwhile, Japan, seeking to dominate Asia, moved in and occupied Vietnam. This dual occupation, French administration under Japanese supervision, further strained the Vietnamese people. During the war, Ho Chi Minh and his allies formed the Viet Minh, or League for the Independence of Vietnam. They fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese, gaining support from peasants and covert assistance from American forces, including the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Vietnam was poised for a new beginning. In September of that year, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence in Hanoi, quoting the US Declaration of Independence. "All men are created equal," he said. "They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." His speech was a powerful appeal to both Vietnamese patriotism and international sympathy. But it was not to last. The French, unwilling to relinquish their colony, returned in force. Thus began the First Indochina War, a brutal conflict between French forces and the Viet Minh. It lasted from 1946 to 1954. The United States, fearing the spread of communism during the Cold War, provided financial and military aid to the French. But the Viet Minh, fighting a guerrilla war from the jungles and mountains, gradually wore them down. The war came to a dramatic climax in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French had fortified a remote valley in northern Vietnam, believing it to be impregnable. But the Viet Minh, under General Von Nguyen Giap, managed to haul heavy artillery through the mountains and surround the valley. After weeks of fierce fighting, the French garrison surrendered. Dien Bien Phu was a turning point, not just for Vietnam, but for the entire colonial world. It marked the end of French imperial power in Southeast Asia and demonstrated that a determined nationalist movement could defeat a European power. The Geneva Accords, signed shortly afterward, temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government in Hanoi. The South would be governed by an anti-communist regime based in Saigon, supported by the United States. Nationwide elections were planned for 1956 to unify the country, but they never happened. Instead, tensions escalated. The United States, determined to contain communism under the domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, others in the region would follow, began pouring resources into South Vietnam. Advisors, money, and weapons flowed in to support the new government led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist who ruled with an increasingly authoritarian hand. Diem's government, however, was deeply unpopular among many South Vietnamese, especially Buddhists and rural villagers. Corruption was rampant, political opposition was suppressed, and the promised democratic reforms never materialized. By the late 1950s, insurgency had begun. The Viet Cong, a communist-led guerrilla movement in the South, began attacking government officials, military outposts, and infrastructure. They were supported by the North, which saw an opportunity to reunify the country under communism. The United States, now under President John F. Kennedy, increased its commitment. The number of American military advisors in Vietnam grew from a few hundred to over 16,000. But this was only the beginning of a much larger, bloodier conflict. As the 1960s dawned, the seeds planted by colonialism, nationalism, and Cold War ideology had grown into a tangled jungle of geopolitical struggle. The Vietnam War, the American War, as it's known in Vietnam, was about to begin in earnest. As the 1960s began, the landscape in Vietnam was shifting in dangerous ways. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism had turned this small Southeast Asian country into a crucial front in the Cold War. What had begun as a colonial struggle had now become a proxy conflict, one where global superpowers would pour their resources, soldiers, and strategies into a land that few Americans could locate on a map. At the heart of the struggle in South Vietnam was President Ngo Dinh Diem. A complex and controversial figure, Diem had been backed by the United States for his anti-communist stance. He was seen as a bulwark against the spread of communism in Asia, especially after the fall of China to communists in 1949 and the bloody Korean War that followed soon after. But Diem's leadership soon showed cracks. Though a devout Catholic, his administration governed a country where the majority of the population practiced Buddhism. Policies favoring Catholics for military and government positions bred resentment. In rural areas, his strategic hamlet program, a policy meant to isolate villagers from communist influence, uprooted people from their homes and communities, creating further alienation. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, also known as the National Liberation Front, gained traction. They were not simply an extension of the North, but were deeply embedded in the South, drawing support from disillusioned farmers and villagers. The Viet Cong utilized guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run raids that confounded the better-equipped South Vietnamese army and its American advisors. Their resilience came not just from training, but from ideology and purpose. Many of them genuinely believed they were liberating their country from imperialist forces. Back in the United States, President John F. Kennedy was closely watching developments in Vietnam. Still reeling from the humiliating failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba and the tense standoff of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was under pressure to assert U.S. dominance and credibility. His administration increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam to over 16,000 by 1963. These advisors trained the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, and often accompanied them on missions, blurring the line between advisory and combat roles. At the same time, discontent against Diem was reaching a boiling point. Buddhist monks began protesting the regime's religious discrimination. One of the most powerful images from this period was that of Thich Quang Duc, a monk who self-immolated in the middle of a busy Saigon intersection in protest. His act shocked the world and highlighted the growing instability of the Diem regime. Behind the scenes, the US government began to consider a drastic move. American officials believed Diem was no longer a reliable partner. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese generals, reportedly with the tacit approval of US intelligence, carried out a coup. Diem and his brother were captured and assassinated. Though the United States did not directly orchestrate the killings, their removal left a power vacuum in South Vietnam that would take years to fill. Just weeks later, the world was further shaken when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president, inheriting not only the presidency, but also a rapidly deteriorating situation in Southeast Asia. Johnson was a man of immense ambition. Domestically, he would become known for the Great Society programs, initiatives aimed at ending poverty and expanding civil rights. But internationally, he was deeply committed to containing communism. Johnson believed that a failure in Vietnam would damage US credibility, both in Asia and around the world. He did not want to be the first American president to lose a war. 1964 proved to be the turning point. That summer, reports emerged of an alleged attack on US naval vessels by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. While the details of the incident were murky and have since been the subject of intense historical scrutiny, the Johnson administration presented it as an unprovoked act of aggression. Congress responded swiftly by passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This resolution marked the beginning of full-scale American military involvement in Vietnam. Soon, US planes were bombing targets in North Vietnam. Troop deployments increased. The war, once a shadow conflict fought in the jungles by local insurgents, was becoming a massive conventional war with helicopters, jets, and battalions of ground troops. But even as American firepower increased, the enemy proved elusive. The Viet Cong, a North Vietnamese army, NVA, fought not only with bullets, but with cunning and patience. They knew the terrain intimately. They built an extensive network of tunnels. They ambushed patrols and melted into the jungle. They were fighting on their own soil for a cause they believed in. The United States, by contrast, was struggling to define its mission. Was it to protect South Vietnam, to destroy communism, to win hearts and minds? American soldiers often found themselves in villages where they could not distinguish friend from foe. The stress, fear, and moral ambiguity of this war would soon take a deep toll. Still, in 1964, there was a sense of momentum. The United States was increasing its presence, flexing its military muscle, and trying to shape Vietnam's destiny. Few could have imagined how long and bloody the road ahead would be. By early 1965, the United States stood at a crossroads. President Lyndon B. Johnson, weighing the advice of his military and civilian advisors, made the momentous decision to escalate the conflict in Vietnam. What had once been a limited engagement was now becoming a full-scale war. The first major step came in March of 1965, when the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to cripple the North's infrastructure, demoralize its leadership, and reduce the flow of men and materials into the South. Over the next 3 years, American aircraft dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives on targets ranging from military bases to industrial zones to transportation networks. But Rolling Thunder did not have the intended effect. North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, absorbed the damage and adapted. Supplies were moved by hand or bicycle along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex web of paths and tunnels stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into the south. The trail became a symbol of Vietnamese resolve and ingenuity. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, US ground troops were arriving in increasing numbers. The first official combat troops, 3,500 Marines, landed at Da Nang in March 1965. That number would balloon to over 200,000 by the end of the year and over 500,000 by 1968. These soldiers, many of them barely, out of high school, found themselves in an alien environment. The jungles were dense and unforgiving. The heat was oppressive. Insects, disease, and booby traps were constant threats. The enemy was often invisible, striking swiftly before disappearing into the wilderness. The American military strategy during this period was centered around search and destroy missions. Rather than hold territory, the goal was to engage and kill as many Viet Cong and NVA fighters as possible. Success was measured in body counts, a grim and controversial metric that often encouraged inflated numbers and tragic civilian casualties. This approach led to intense battles in places like the Ia Drang Valley, where US forces fought the NVA in the first major ground engagement between regular armies. The battle, which took place in November 1965, saw heavy casualties on both sides and demonstrated the ferocity of the North Vietnamese troops. It also underscored the limitations of American firepower. Despite helicopters, artillery, and air support, the enemy was not easily defeated. In the towns and villages of South Vietnam, the situation was equally complex. The US and its allies launched programs like the Strategic Hamlet Program and pacification campaigns to win the hearts and minds of the rural population. But corruption, poor planning, and cultural misunderstandings often undermined these efforts. Villagers were caught between two sides, punished by one for aiding the other, and trust was hard to earn. The Viet Cong, for their part, were masters of asymmetric warfare. They used the cover of the jungle, the support of sympathetic locals, and the element of surprise to devastating effect. They set booby traps using bamboo spikes, hidden grenades, and tripwires. They attacked convoys, ambushed patrols, and sabotaged infrastructure. Their tactics were not only effective, but psychologically draining. American soldiers lived with the constant fear that any step might be their last. The enemy could be a child with a grenade, a woman with a gun, or a farmer with a mine. This blurred moral landscape led to deep stress and, at times, tragic overreactions. One of the most infamous examples was the My Lai massacre in March 1968, when US troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a small village. Though this event would not become widely known until later, it would eventually become a powerful symbol of the war's moral failures. Back home, the mood was beginning to shift. At first, the war had widespread support. Many Americans believed in the necessity of stopping communism. But as the number of US casualties rose, and as television brought the brutal reality of the conflict into living rooms across the country, doubts began to grow. In 1967, protests intensified. Students marched on college campuses. Clergy spoke out against the war. Prominent figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began to criticize not only the war's morality, but its impact on domestic programs and racial justice. The draft, which disproportionately affected poor and minority communities, became a flashpoint of anger. Yet even as the public mood soured, the war machine continued to churn. General William Westmoreland, the US commander in Vietnam, insisted that the enemy was on the brink of defeat. The phrase, "light at the end of the tunnel," became a common refrain, echoed by officials who believed that just a little more pressure, a few more troops, or another offensive would bring victory. But in reality, the United States was becoming mired in a conflict it did not fully understand, against an enemy that could not be bombed into submission or easily defined on a battlefield. The Vietnamese people on both sides suffered immensely. Entire villages were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Farmers planted crops by day and buried the dead by night. The land itself, so lush and green, was scarred by napalm, Agent Orange, and relentless bombing. Still, both sides pressed on. The North Vietnamese leadership believed that time was on their side, that eventually American will would crumble. The Americans, convinced of their technological and military superiority, believed that persistence would yield victory. Neither side was entirely wrong. But the cost would be staggering. As 1967 drew to a close, over 15,000 American soldiers had died. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded or traumatized. Vietnamese. Casualties, military and civilian, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. And yet, the deadliest and most pivotal moment of the war was still to come. As the war continued into 1966 and 1967, the US military presence in Vietnam became an all-consuming force. What had started as a mission to support the South Vietnamese government had morphed into a full-fledged American war. Helicopters buzzed through the air like insects. Massive bases rose from the countryside, complete with PX stores, movie theaters, and barbed wire perimeters. American soldiers fought, sweated, and died far from home in a conflict that seemed increasingly unmoored from victory. The daily rhythm of American troops followed a grueling, repetitive pattern. Patrols into the jungle, firefights with unseen enemies, the blare of gunfire followed by sudden silence. Many soldiers served 12-month tours, counting down the days until they could return to what they called the world, a name that revealed how surreal and alien Vietnam felt to them. Yet even when they returned, many found they no longer fit in. Veterans faced a cold reception. There were no parades, no national unity. Instead, there was growing hostility, confusion, and even shame. The Vietnam War would become the first in US history where returning soldiers were sometimes treated as symbols of political failure. Back in Vietnam, the tactics employed by both sides became increasingly brutal. The Viet Cong blended into the population, sometimes willingly, sometimes through coercion. Villages could serve as safe havens one day, then as ambush sites the next. American forces responded with overwhelming firepower, often resulting in significant civilian casualties. Entire hamlets were reduced to ashes in the name of pacification. The use of chemical defoliants, most notoriously Agent Orange, added another layer of horror. These substances were intended to strip the jungle of cover, exposing enemy movement and supply lines, but they also poisoned the land, water, and people. The long-term health effects would be devastating for both Vietnamese civilians and US veterans. Psychological warfare also played a role. The United States dropped propaganda leaflets, broadcast radio messages, and sought to fracture enemy morale. But these efforts were often met with indifference or suspicion. The Vietnamese, having endured foreign occupation and conflict for decades, were not easily swayed by pamphlets or promises. In 1966, the war effort expanded beyond the borders of Vietnam. Covert operations in Laos and Cambodia targeted segments of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, attempting to sever the North's lifeline to the southern insurgency. These operations, often conducted in secret and without the knowledge of Congress, violated the neutrality of both countries and sowed the seeds for future instability. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese government, still struggling with corruption, coups, and internal division, remained heavily dependent on American support. President Nguyen Van Thieu emerged as the dominant figure in Saigon, but his government lacked the legitimacy and popular support necessary to unify the country. Many ordinary South Vietnamese citizens were caught in the middle, threatened by the Viet Cong, distrusted by their own government, and bombarded by American firepower. In the skies, the United States dominated. B-52 bombers flew missions from Guam, unleashing torrents of destruction on the Vietnamese countryside. Fighter jets streaked across the sky, engaging in dogfights with North Vietnamese MiGs. The air war was relentless, and its scars remain visible today in the form of bomb craters, deforested land, and unexploded ordnance. But even as American forces inflicted heavy losses, the war showed no signs of ending. The Viet Cong, a North Vietnamese army, fueled by ideology, nationalism, and a deep understanding of their land, continued to fight with unshakable determination. They were not fighting to win in a conventional sense. They were fighting to outlast, to endure, to survive longer than their opponents could stomach. By the end of 1967, nearly 500,000 US troops were stationed in Vietnam. Tens of thousands had already been killed or wounded. Billions of dollars were being spent annually, and still, victory remained elusive. That same year, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the principal architects of the war strategy, began to lose faith. He privately expressed doubts about the war's winnability and eventually resigned. His departure marked a shift in the mood of Washington, one that would become more pronounced in the years to follow. On the battlefield, the US military sought to break the stalemate through increased firepower and massive operations like Operation Cedar Falls and Operation Junction City. These were meant to root out Viet Cong strongholds near Saigon and disrupt supply chains. Yet for all the effort, the gains were fleeting. Villages were razed, forests burned, and still the enemy returned. It became clear to many observers that the war was not just a military battle. It was a political and cultural conflict that could not be solved through bombs and bullets alone. The American government's efforts to control public perception began to clash with the growing skepticism of journalists, academics, and returning veterans. By late 1967, President Johnson faced growing unrest at home. Protests were becoming larger and louder. Television broadcasts showed the carnage in Vietnam night after night. Influential senators such as William Fulbright and Robert Kennedy began to question the war openly, and yet Johnson continued to push forward, convinced that withdrawal would mean defeat not just in Vietnam, but for American credibility around the globe. As Christmas approached in 1967, both sides prepared for the coming new year. But what neither the American nor South Vietnamese governments knew was that their enemy, patient, methodical, and quietly confident, was about to launch a massive offensive that would change everything. The Tet Offensive was coming. The year 1968 was a watershed moment in the Vietnam War, and its defining event was the Tet Offensive, a massive and coordinated assault launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that would reshape public perception, military strategy, and the political fate of a sitting American president. The offensive was named after Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnam. Traditionally, this was a time of family gatherings, celebration, and national pause. A truce had been observed during Tet in previous years, and US and South Vietnamese forces expected the same in 1968. Many troops had even stood down from alert, but the leadership in Hanoi had a different plan. Under General Vo Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese orchestrated a stunningly ambitious operation. The goal was not to defeat US and South Vietnamese forces in a conventional military sense, but to spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population. one that would lead to the collapse of the Saigon government and a decisive political shift. In the early hours of January 30th and 31, 1968, tens of thousands of communist fighters launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. These included provincial capitals, military bases, and for the first time, the capital itself, Saigon. The intensity and scope of the offensive shocked US and South Vietnamese leaders. In Saigon, the US embassy came under direct assault. Viet Cong commandos breached the perimeter and engaged in a gun battle with American Marines inside the compound. Though the attack was repelled, the symbolism was enormous. No place was safe. No position was unassailable. Elsewhere, fierce battles erupted in cities like Hue, an ancient imperial capital. For nearly a month, US Marines and South Vietnamese troops fought block by block to retake the city. The Battle of Hue became one of the bloodiest urban confrontations of the entire war, with massive casualties and the destruction of historic landmarks. During the occupation, the communists executed hundreds of people suspected of collaborating with the South or the Americans, a grim reminder of the ideological ruthlessness driving the conflict. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the North. Over 45,000 communist soldiers were killed, and they failed to hold any major city for long. The hoped-for uprising among the South Vietnamese people did not materialize. The ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, held its ground in many areas and, alongside US forces, inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. But in the realm of perception, particularly in the United States, the Tet Offensive was a stunning blow. For years, American military leaders had claimed that victory was near, that the enemy was being worn down, that the end was in sight. General William Westmoreland, in particular, had assured the public that the communists were incapable of launching any significant offensive. The sheer scale and audacity of Tet shattered that narrative overnight. Television networks broadcast images of the chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed from televisions in American living rooms. News anchors, including the venerable Walter Cronkite, began to question the war openly. After visiting Vietnam, Cronkite famously declared, "To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory conclusion." That single sentence echoed across the nation. If even Walter Cronkite, a symbol of trust and integrity, believed the war could not be won, what hope remained? President Lyndon B. Johnson, watching public support erode in real time, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Indeed, the political fallout was swift and severe. Anti-war protests intensified across the country. College campuses erupted in demonstration. Draft resistance increased. Prominent figures like Senator Robert Kennedy and Senator Eugene McCarthy launched campaigns against Johnson's re-election bid. By March 1968, Johnson made a stunning announcement. He would not seek another term as president. It was a direct consequence of Tet, both in its immediate military implications and in its seismic effect on American public opinion. In Vietnam, the aftermath of the offensive was equally profound. Though the communist forces had suffered heavy casualties, they had proven that they could strike anywhere, at any time. They had exposed the vulnerabilities of the South Vietnamese government and demonstrated that the war was far from over. For the United States, Tet marked the beginning of a slow, painful strategic shift. Johnson, now focused on peace talks, ordered a partial halt to bombing in the north. American commanders began to speak of Vietnamization, the idea that South Vietnamese forces would gradually take over combat duties as US troops withdrew. This concept would become the cornerstone of future policy under Johnson's successor. The war had reached a turning point, not because the US was militarily defeated, but because the American public, deeply disillusioned, no longer supported the cost, the bloodshed, or the narrative of progress. Tet had revealed the gap between official statements and battlefield reality. The year 1968 would continue to bring turmoil. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, riots in American cities, and a violent Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Against this backdrop, the Vietnam War loomed as a central, unresolved tragedy. In the jungles and cities of Vietnam, the war went on. But from this point forward, its course would be shaped not just by battles and bombs, but by political will, public opinion, and a growing desire on both sides to find an end. After the shock of the Tet Offensive, the American mission in Vietnam faced its most serious internal reckoning. The year 1968 was not just a turning point in the war, it was one of the most volatile and transformative years in American history. The immediate aftermath of Tet left the US military deeply unsettled. Although American and South Vietnamese forces had ultimately repelled the offensive, the psychological toll was immense. Military leaders had promised victory was near, but the images of chaos and vulnerability in Saigon and Hue had contradicted those assurances on live television. Suddenly, it no longer mattered that the enemy had suffered far greater casualties. What mattered was that Americans had begun to doubt the entire premise of the war. Public confidence in the government began to crumble. Protests surged on college campuses and in major cities. The anti-war movement, once dismissed as marginal or radical, was now embraced by students, clergy, civil rights leaders, and veterans alike. Increasingly, Americans questioned why their sons were being drafted and sent to die in a war that seemed both unwinnable and unclear in its purpose. At the center of the political storm was President Lyndon B. Johnson. His approval ratings plummeted. Advisors like Clark Clifford, who replaced Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense, urged the president to seek a political solution. Johnson, deeply affected by the backlash, addressed the nation. On March 31st, 1968, and stunned the country by announcing, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." This decision marked a symbolic end to the era of full escalation. Johnson had been the architect of America's massive military involvement. His exit opened the door to a new approach, one that would increasingly prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation. Meanwhile, on the ground in Vietnam, the conflict raged on. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, though bloodied, regrouped and continued to fight. The US military launched new operations to push the enemy out of the positions they had briefly occupied during Tet. Villages that had been contested were retaken. The streets of Hue were slowly cleared. But the urban fighting revealed another troubling truth. The enemy could not only survive against superior firepower, they could adapt and endure. In Saigon, the South Vietnamese government struggled to maintain order. The political and military leadership, while bolstered by US support, lacked popular legitimacy. The population, traumatized by years of war, often saw little difference between one side or the other. The hope of a spontaneous uprising against communism, once so central to American strategy, now seemed naive. Amid this uncertainty, American leaders began floating the idea of Vietnamization more seriously. The concept, introduced late in Johnson's term and later embraced by his successor, proposed a gradual withdrawal of American troops while strengthening the ARVN to take over defense responsibilities. It was a face-saving strategy, designed to shift the burden of the war onto the Vietnamese themselves without conceding defeat. Diplomatic overtures also began to take shape. In May 1968, preliminary peace talks opened in Paris, bringing together representatives from the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the National Liberation Front. Though marred by disagreements over procedures and symbolism, such as the shape of the negotiating table, these talks marked the beginning of a slow and painful process toward resolution. Even as negotiations sputtered, American combat operations continued. Bombing resumed in selected areas. Battles flared in the Central Highlands and along the DMZ. Villages were cleared, only to be re-infiltrated. It was a war of attrition, where success was defined by casualty ratios, not territory gained or goals achieved. The psychological strain on American troops deepened. Drug use, desertion, and morale problems increased. Soldiers cycled through their 12-month tours, often returning home with physical wounds or invisible scars, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In the United States, 1968 continued to spiral into unrest. In April, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, sparking riots in more than 100 cities. Just 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, a leading anti-war candidate and brother of the slain president, was also gunned down after winning the California primary. By the summer, the Democratic Party fractured. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, anti-war demonstrators clashed with police in scenes of brutality broadcast to a shocked public. Inside the convention hall, chaos reigned as the party tried to reconcile its divisions. Amid the turmoil, Richard Nixon emerged as the Republican nominee, promising peace with honor. He appealed to what he called the silent majority, Americans who, he claimed, supported law and order, patriotism, and a strong stand against communism. His message resonated with voters fatigued by war, civil unrest, and the erosion of trust in institutions. As 1968 came to a close, the United States stood at a crossroads. The war in Vietnam continued, with no clear end in sight. American casualties mounted, the political center was fraying, and a new president prepared to take office, pledging to end the war, but not at any cost. The Tet Offensive had changed everything. It had not delivered the military victory Hanoi had hoped for, but it had succeeded in its deeper objective, to undermine the American will to continue the war. It exposed the limits of firepower, the fragility of confidence, and the deep fractures within American society. The war was not over. But the illusion of triumph had been shattered. In January 1969, Richard Milhous Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States. He inherited a war that had already claimed over 30,000 American lives, with hundreds of thousands more wounded or missing, and a country torn apart by protest, disillusionment, and grief. Nixon entered office with a promise to achieve peace with honor, a phrase that would come to define the paradox at the heart of his Vietnam strategy. Nixon was no stranger to Cold War politics. He had made his name as a staunch anti-communist in the 1950s. Yet he also recognized the political and social cost of a continued American presence in Vietnam. His challenge was to find a way to reduce US involvement without appearing to capitulate to North Vietnam or abandoning America's global credibility. The cornerstone of Nixon's approach was a policy called Vietnamization, first articulated in public by Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. The idea was to gradually withdraw American combat troops while simultaneously training and equipping the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to take over military responsibilities. It was both a tactical strategy and a political maneuver meant to buy time, reduce US casualties, and shore up domestic support. The first significant withdrawal came in June 1969, when 25,000 US troops were sent home. More would follow. By the end of Nixon's first term, the number of American troops in Vietnam would fall from over 540,000 to fewer than 160,000. But while troop numbers declined, the intensity of US air power did not. In fact, Nixon's most controversial decisions would involve the expansion of the war, not within Vietnam, but into neighboring Cambodia and Laos. For years, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sophisticated network of supply routes, had allowed the North Vietnamese to move men and materiel through these countries and into South Vietnam. Though officially neutral, both Laos and Cambodia were deeply entangled in the conflict. Nixon, determined to cut off these lifelines, authorized secret bombing campaigns in both nations, operations that were hidden from the American public and even much of Congress. Operation Menu, which began in March 1969, targeted alleged Viet Cong sanctuaries in eastern Cambodia. Over the next 4 years, more than 500,000 tons of bombs would be dropped on Cambodia in what became one of the most extensive bombing campaigns in history. The human toll was staggering. Villages were destroyed, civilians were killed, and the social fabric of Cambodia was deeply destabilized, helping pave the way for the eventual rise of the Khmer Rouge, one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. Nixon's secrecy and deception about these bombings became one of the defining features of his presidency. Leaks to the press began to expose the scope of the operations. Inside the Pentagon and the State Department, officials grew uneasy. Outside, the anti-war movement found new fuel. Then, in April 1970, Nixon shocked the nation by announcing a full-scale invasion of Cambodia by American and South Vietnamese forces. The stated goal was to disrupt enemy supply lines and command centers. In the short term, the operation captured weapons caches and temporarily slowed enemy operations. But the long-term consequences were disastrous. The invasion ignited a firestorm of protest across the United States. On college campuses, demonstrations swelled. One of the most infamous moments of the anti-war movement occurred just days later, on May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio. During a protest against the Cambodian incursion, members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire on unarmed students. 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded. The tragedy was captured in haunting photographs and widely circulated in newspapers and magazines. The nation recoiled in horror. Across the country, over 450 college campuses shut down in protest. The sense of national crisis deepened. In the midst of this turmoil, Nixon continued to pursue his policy of linkage, trying to connect progress in Vietnam to broader diplomatic efforts with China and the Soviet Union. He believed that improved relations with these superpowers could pressure Hanoi to accept a negotiated peace. Indeed, 1971 brought a significant diplomatic breakthrough. The United States opened back-channel communications with China, culminating in Nixon's historic visit the following year. The Soviet Union, too, engaged in high-level talks with the US on arms control and trade. While these developments were significant for global geopolitics, their impact on the ground in Vietnam was less immediate. Within Vietnam, the war dragged on. As American ground forces withdrew, South Vietnamese troops were thrust into the spotlight. Under Vietnamization, ARVN forces launched their own major operations, including Operation Lam Son 7/19 in early 1971, a bold assault into Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The results were sobering. Poor coordination, fierce resistance, and lack of effective air support once US forces pulled back led to a disastrous retreat. Thousands of South Vietnamese troops were killed or wounded. The operation, intended as a demonstration of ARVN's readiness, instead exposed its ongoing weaknesses. At home, public opinion remained deeply divided. Nixon attempted to shift the narrative with appeals to the silent majority, casting protesters as unpatriotic and disruptive. But even as he won re-election in a landslide in 1972, the war's toll remained undeniable. The Pentagon's own secret study of the war, the Pentagon Papers, was leaked in 1971 by Daniel Ellsberg, revealing years of government deception and mismanagement. The documents painted a picture of consistent lies about the war's progress, purpose, and prospects for victory. The release of the Pentagon Papers deepened the crisis of trust between the American people and their government. The credibility gap, already wide, became a chasm. While Nixon fought in court to block their publication, the US Supreme Court ultimately upheld the First Amendment, allowing the press to publish the documents. As 1971 drew to a close, the Vietnam War had become a war of attrition, not just in Southeast Asia, but in the hearts and minds of those back home. The promises of victory had faded. The language of sacrifice and duty sounded hollow, and the question on everyone's mind remained: how would it end? By 1972, The Vietnam War had entered its final phase, though few realized just how close the end truly was. The United States, under President Richard Nixon, had dramatically reduced its troop presence, but air power remained central to its strategy. On the other side, North Vietnam, though bruised by years of war and relentless bombing, remained resolute. The key to ending the war now lay in diplomacy. Peace negotiations had been ongoing in Paris since 1968, but progress had been painfully slow. Mutual distrust, political considerations, and strategic maneuvering on both sides made meaningful compromise difficult. The Americans demanded that North Vietnamese troops withdraw from the south and recognize the government in Saigon. The North, in turn, insisted on the removal of all US forces and a political settlement that included the Viet Cong. In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a powerful new offensive, known as the Easter Offensive. It was their largest conventional military campaign of the war, involving tanks, heavy artillery, and large troop formations. The offensive caught many by surprise. South Vietnamese forces struggled to respond, and key cities, including Quang Tri, fell to the communists. The United States reacted with overwhelming air power. Nixon authorized Operation Linebacker, a massive bombing campaign targeting supply lines, bridges, and industrial facilities in the north. For the first time, US forces mined Haiphong Harbor, a key point of Soviet and Chinese supply shipments. As the air war intensified, diplomatic momentum grew. Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger saw an opportunity to pressure Hanoi into a settlement. Kissinger engaged in secret negotiations with North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho, and by October 1972, they had reached a tentative agreement. The deal called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of US forces, and the return of American prisoners of war. Importantly, it also allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in the south, a condition that deeply alarmed the South Vietnamese government. President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam objected strenuously. He saw the deal as a betrayal, and he refused to sign. Under pressure, Nixon paused the agreement and attempted to renegotiate. When talks stalled, Nixon turned once again to air power in what would become one of the most controversial episodes of the war. In December 1972, the United States launched Operation Linebacker II, often referred to as the Christmas bombings. For nearly 2 weeks, B-52 bombers relentlessly targeted Hanoi and Haiphong in one of the most intense aerial bombardments of the entire conflict. Hundreds of civilians were killed. International condemnation was swift, but the pressure worked. By January 1973, all sides returned to Paris and finalized the peace agreement. On January 27th, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government representing the Viet Cong. The agreement stipulated the withdrawal of all US troops within 60 days, the return of prisoners of war, and a political process to determine South Vietnam's future. The US agreed to end all military operations in Vietnam. With that, the longest war in American history, at least until that point, was officially over for the United States. But the peace was fragile. The US withdrawal left behind a South Vietnamese government that was still dependent on American aid, weapons, and logistical support. Despite receiving billions of dollars in military assistance, the ARVN was stretched thin, plagued by corruption, and facing an enemy that had never accepted defeat. Even as American troops boarded planes for home, the North Vietnamese carefully positioned their forces across the countryside, waiting. The war, for them, had not ended. It had only entered a new phase. Back in the United States, the mood was one of exhaustion. The American people, after nearly a decade of conflict, were ready to move on. Political attention shifted to domestic concerns. The Watergate scandal soon consumed the Nixon administration, ultimately leading to the president's resignation in August 1974. With Nixon gone, the US commitment to South Vietnam began to waver. President Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, faced a Congress unwilling to authorize further aid. The American military presence was gone. The air support was gone. And soon, the funding would be too. Sensing their moment, North Vietnam launched a final offensive in March 1975. The South Vietnamese defenses collapsed with stunning speed. One province after another fell. Soldiers deserted. Civilians fled in panic. The North's tanks rolled through shattered roads and bomb-scarred terrain with little resistance. By April, the situation was dire. American personnel began evacuating from Saigon. Helicopters lifted off from rooftops in scenes of chaos and desperation, ferrying diplomats, journalists, and a small number of South Vietnamese allies to waiting ships off the coast. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. President Duong Van Minh, who had taken office just 2 days earlier, surrendered unconditionally. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and the Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. The Vietnam War was over. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marked the official end of the Vietnam War, but for the millions affected, soldiers, civilians, and entire nations, the story was far from over. The war's legacy would unfold across decades, leaving scars that were emotional, political, environmental, and deeply human. In Vietnam, reunification brought peace, but not necessarily healing. The newly unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam faced enormous challenges. Nearly 3 decades of near-constant warfare against the French, the Americans, and then each other had devastated the land. Entire regions were reduced to rubble. Farmland had been saturated with chemicals. Bomb craters dotted the countryside. Infrastructure, industry, and transportation networks lay in ruins. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the communist government launched widespread political and social reforms to consolidate control. This included the establishment of re-education camps, where former officials, military officers, intellectuals, and anyone associated with the South Vietnamese government or the United States were detained. Though framed as rehabilitation efforts, many of these camps were brutal facilities where prisoners endured forced labor, indoctrination, malnutrition, and abuse. Tens of thousands were sent to these camps, and many were held for years. Alongside political repression came sweeping economic changes. The new government pursued collectivization of agriculture and centralized economic planning, similar to the models used in China, and the Soviet Union. Private businesses were nationalized. Farmlands were seized and reorganized into cooperatives. These policies, intended to create a socialist utopia, instead led to massive inefficiencies, food shortages, and economic stagnation. Disillusionment grew, especially in the South. Many who had once opposed the communists now found themselves living under an increasingly authoritarian regime with little tolerance for dissent. For hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, the answer was flight. What followed was one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Between 1975 and the early 1990s, more than 1.5 million Vietnamese people fled the country. Many took to the sea in rickety boats, risking death from storms, pirates, starvation, and exposure. These boat people, as they came to be known, sought refuge in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and eventually in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. Not all survived the journey, but those who did built new lives, often overcoming extraordinary hardship and trauma to establish thriving Vietnamese communities abroad. Back in the United States, the war left deep and lasting wounds. By the end of the conflict, more than 58,000 American soldiers had died in Vietnam. Over 150,000 were wounded, and countless more returned home with invisible injuries, psychological trauma, substance abuse problems, and profound dislocation. For many veterans, coming home was not a return to celebration and gratitude, but to confusion, apathy, or even hostility. The political divisiveness of the war had tainted its perception, and returning soldiers were often treated as symbols of a failed policy rather than as individuals who had sacrificed deeply. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association until 1980, but its symptoms were widespread among Vietnam veterans long before then. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and depression haunted many. Suicides and homelessness among veterans rose sharply in the years after the war. The war also had a corrosive effect on American political institutions. Public trust in the government plummeted, a process accelerated by the Pentagon Papers, which revealed years of official deception, and the Watergate scandal, which forced Nixon from office in 1974. The credibility gap between what Americans were told and what they had witnessed on television, in newspapers, or on the battlefield eroded the foundation of civic faith. Culturally, the Vietnam War became a central theme of American life. It inspired books, films, music, and political discourse that tried to grapple with the complexity and tragedy of the conflict. Movies like The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket explored different dimensions of the war: the chaos, the fear, the brotherhood, the madness. Novels and memoirs by veterans offered unflinching accounts of their experiences. Protest songs, once rallying cries of the anti-war movement, became anthems of reflection and loss. Yet even as the cultural conversation evolved, the physical legacy of the war remained. In Vietnam, the use of Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant designed to remove jungle cover, had devastating long-term effects. Exposure to dioxin, one of its key components, led to a host of health issues, including cancer, birth defects, and neurological disorders. Both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans suffered from its consequences, and generations born after the war continued to exhibit symptoms of exposure. Landmines and unexploded ordnance also remained a deadly hazard. Even decades later, farmers and children were maimed or killed by munitions buried in rice paddies and hillsides. Cleanup efforts, both by the Vietnamese government and international organizations, continued well into the 21st century. Politically, the war reshaped US foreign policy. The Vietnam Syndrome, a term used to describe the American public's reluctance to engage in foreign military interventions, dominated strategic thinking for years. Future presidents were cautious about committing troops abroad, mindful of the limits of military power and the importance of public support. Yet, the spectre of Vietnam loomed large in subsequent conflicts. From Lebanon to Somalia, from Iraq to Afghanistan, policymakers and generals studied the wars. Failures, hoping to avoid repeating them. But the lessons of Vietnam, ambiguous objectives, underestimating an enemy's resolve, fighting a war without clear political solutions, proved difficult to apply in new contexts. In Vietnam itself, the post-war decades were marked by slow recovery and painful transformation. Economic reforms in the 1980s, known as Doi Moi, gradually moved the country toward a more market-oriented system. These changes lifted millions out of poverty and opened Vietnam to the global economy. By the 2000s, Vietnam had become one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing economies. Diplomatic relations with the United States were normalized in 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon. American presidents began visiting Vietnam. Veterans returned to old battlefields, sometimes to find peace, sometimes to help with demining, or to reconnect with old friends and memories. Trade, tourism, and cultural exchanges flourished. And yet, the war remains a defining chapter in the national consciousness, both for Americans and Vietnamese. It is a story of resistance and resilience, of tragedy and transformation, a story that continues to echo in policy debates, in cultural memory, and in the lives of those who endured it. The memory of the Vietnam War did not end with treaties, troop withdrawals, or the fall of Saigon. In many ways, the war lived on more vividly after the last bullet was fired, through grief, reflection, and debate. As both the United States and Vietnam moved into the post-war period, they faced the difficult task of confronting the war's meaning and legacy. In the United States, the process of reckoning was public and painful. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, Vietnam veterans began to demand recognition, respect, and resources. Many had returned to a country that seemed embarrassed by them, and they fought for decades to receive adequate health care, psychological support, and compensation. One of the most powerful symbols of this reckoning came in 1982 with the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Designed by Maya Lin, a young architecture student at the time, the memorial was stark and simple. 2 black granite walls, engraved with the names of the fallen, arranged chronologically. The design was initially controversial. Critics felt it lacked traditional heroism. But for many veterans and families, its simplicity spoke volumes. Visitors traced names with their fingers, left flowers, dog tags, letters, and tears. The wall became not just a memorial, but a space for national reflection and personal mourning. It reminded America of the cost of war, not in ideology or geopolitics, but in lives lost and futures altered. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the state-controlled narrative of the war centered on victory over imperialism. The official history emphasized the heroism of the North and the resilience of the people. Monuments were erected. Museums told stories of triumph and struggle. But for many Vietnamese, especially in the South, the story was more complicated. Families who had supported the South Vietnamese government often faced surveillance, discrimination, and restricted opportunities. Former ARVN soldiers were marginalized, their service officially ignored or condemned. Over time, some began to share their stories quietly through oral history projects, diasporic communities, or returning visitors. These stories revealed a more nuanced portrait of the war, one not of clear good and evil, but of difficult choices, divided loyalties, and shared suffering. In both countries, the war became a source of cultural exploration. In the United States, literature, film, and art continued to probe the meaning of Vietnam. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried offered a haunting and poetic reflection on memory, trauma, and storytelling. Oliver Stone, a Vietnam veteran himself, directed films that exposed the war's chaos and corruption. Songs like Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA and Paul Hardcastle's 19 became anthems of disillusionment. Vietnam also saw a growing body of post-war literature, including works by writers who had once fought for the North. These stories often describe the hardship of war, the ambiguity of victory, and the challenges of reintegration into peacetime society. By the 1990s and early 2000s, as the wounds of war began to scar over, the two nations took significant steps toward reconciliation. Diplomatic. Relations between the United States and Vietnam were officially restored in 1995. Trade resumed. Embassies opened. Former enemies shook hands. American companies invested in Vietnam's growing economy, and tourists arrived by the thousands to visit Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, the Mekong Delta, and former battlefields turned historical sites. One major area of cooperation was the search for missing soldiers. Thousands of US servicemen had remained unaccounted for after the war. Through joint operations, Vietnamese and American teams excavated crash sites, examined remains, and worked to provide closure for grieving families. Likewise, Vietnamese families received help identifying and honoring their own missing. Another vital area was the ongoing remediation of war damage. The legacy of Agent Orange, for example, was tackled through partnerships between the US government, NGOs, and Vietnamese authorities. Decontamination projects at former US bases like Da Nang began to reduce dioxin levels in soil and water. Medical aid programs provided assistance to those affected by congenital disabilities believed to be linked to chemical exposure. And yet, despite these efforts, the legacy of Vietnam continued to cast a shadow over US foreign policy. The phrase, "another Vietnam," became shorthand for quagmires to be avoided. Political leaders and military planners invoked the war as a cautionary tale. The need for clear objectives, defined exit strategies, and public support became core lessons. repeated with every new intervention, from Lebanon in 1983 to Somalia, from Iraq in 1991, and again in 2003, to the long war in Afghanistan. But those lessons were not always heeded. In Afghanistan, as in Vietnam, the US supported a weak central government facing an entrenched insurgency. As the war dragged on for 2 decades, comparisons to Vietnam grew louder. When Kabul fell in 2021 and images of helicopters evacuating diplomats flashed across the news, many saw history repeating itself. Vietnam had become more than a war. It was a lens through which future wars would be viewed. It was also, increasingly, a subject for education. High school and college curricula began to explore the war in greater depth, examining it not only through the lens of military history, but also through its ethical, cultural, and psychological dimensions. Scholars debated the war's necessity, its execution, and its impact. One key question lingered. Was the Vietnam War inevitable? Some historians argue it was the result of Cold War logic gone awry, an over-reliance on military solutions to political problems. Others point to missed diplomatic opportunities, or to a profound misunderstanding of Vietnamese nationalism. Still others frame it as a tragedy born of good intentions and flawed assumptions. Whatever the cause, the outcome is undeniable. Millions of lives lost, a country reshaped, and a generation marked forever. The story of the Vietnam War is often told in terms of strategies and battles, presidents and generals. But beneath the layers of political decisions and military maneuvers were millions of personal stories, each one a small world shaped by choices, loyalties, and chance. These stories, often lost in the enormity of the conflict, offer glimpses into the human soul in times of war. Consider the story of Lily Hayslip, a young Vietnamese girl caught between opposing forces. Born in central Vietnam, she grew up in a rural village where both the Viet Cong and South Vietnamese troops passed through. As a teenager, she was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually fled the country. Years later, she returned as a peace activist, founding organizations to help rebuild Vietnam and bridge the divide between former enemies. Her memoir, When Heaven and Earth Changed Places, became a testament to survival, resilience, and reconciliation. Or take the story of Colonel Hal Moore, commander of the US 7th Cavalry during the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, one of the first major engagements between American and North Vietnamese forces. In that brutal conflict, he saw firsthand the strength and resolve of the enemy and the heavy price of engagement. After the war, Moore worked to preserve the memory of those who fought under his command. His book, We Were Soldiers Once, and Young, co-authored with journalist Joe Galloway, gave a voice to men who had faced death together and lived to remember it. There was also Vo, Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind the North's military strategy. A former history teacher turned revolutionary general, Giap had already defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu before turning his attention to the Americans. His genius lay not in overwhelming force, but in his understanding of time and willpower. He believed wars were won not by armies alone, but by the ability to endure, an idea deeply rooted in Vietnam's long history of resistance to foreign rule. On the American home front, stories emerged of draft resistors and protesters, people who believed that refusing to fight was also an act of courage. Some fled to Canada, others faced jail time, and many later returned to complex receptions. Their actions sparked debates about patriotism, duty, and moral responsibility. In time, some were pardoned. Others never quite reconciled their choices. And within the Vietnamese diaspora, stories unfolded of children separated from parents, of boat journeys that lasted weeks, of refugees who arrived in strange lands with nothing but hope and memory. Their lives were shaped by the war, but not defined by it. Across cities in the United States, Australia, and Europe, these families built new communities, carrying the language, cuisine, and culture of a country they once called home. As these personal stories emerged, they began to fill in the vast, impersonal canvas of history. They reminded us that every statistic, every death toll, every casualty number had a name, a family, and a story. Yet memory is not only about what is remembered, it is also about what is forgotten or deliberately left out. For decades, certain narratives dominated. In Vietnam, the communist government controlled the official story, suppressing dissenting voices. In the United States, the narrative was often shaped by politics, first glorifying intervention, then vilifying it. Over time, historians began to challenge these simplified accounts. They examined declassified documents, oral histories, and local perspectives. What emerged was a more complicated and more truthful picture, one that acknowledged the failures, the humanity, and the many layers of this conflict. Museums, both in Vietnam and the US, evolved. Exhibits once dedicated solely to propaganda or heroism began including testimonials from civilians, photographs of daily life during the war, and artifacts from both sides. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, once known as the Museum of American War Crimes, softened its tone, though the legacy of pain remains vivid in its halls. Academic studies of the war broadened as well. Scholars investigated the roles of women in the war, not only as nurses and caretakers, but as soldiers, spies, and leaders. Others examined the environmental consequences, the impact on indigenous populations, and the psychological toll on entire generations. The Vietnam War also prompted a rethinking of how wars are documented and remembered. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington set a precedent for how societies honor the fallen without glorifying the cause. Its reflective black surface invites silence, contemplation, and personal interpretation, a stark contrast to the towering statues of past wars. In Vietnam, memorials to fallen soldiers are often more communal. Small altars in villages, monuments in cities, and annual days of remembrance reflect a cultural emphasis on honoring ancestors and collective sacrifice. For many Vietnamese, both North and South, the war is something to remember quietly, with grief, reverence, and a hope to avoid repeating the past. In literature, film, and art, the war continued to echo, but newer generations, unburdened by direct experience, began to ask different questions. What did the war mean? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from it? The Vietnam War became a mirror. It reflected the ambitions and failures of empires, the courage and suffering of individuals, and the fragile line between heroism and tragedy. It taught us that no war ends cleanly. The violence continues in memory, in the land, and in the lives that follow. But it also taught us about endurance, about healing, about the power of remembrance. As the dust settled from the Vietnam War and the world moved forward, scholars, veterans, policymakers, and everyday people began to reflect on what the war had taught or failed to teach. In time, these reflections took shape as lessons, hard-earned, often painful, and still debated. Lesson 1. The limits of military power. Perhaps the most fundamental lesson was that superior technology and firepower do not guarantee victory. The United States had overwhelming military resources, but the war revealed the limits of what bombs and bullets can accomplish in a political struggle. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood the terrain, the people, and the value of patience. Their strategy focused not on defeating the US militarily, but on outlasting them. Lesson 2. Know the culture, know the war. Another lesson emerged from misunderstanding the Vietnamese people. American leaders often saw the war as a front in the global battle against communism. But for many Vietnamese, it was a fight for independence, shaped by decades of colonial rule and civil division. The US failed to recognize the nationalist dimension of the conflict, mistaking loyalty to Vietnam for loyalty to communism. Lesson 3. War without clear goals is a path to failure. Throughout the war, US objectives were vague and shifting. Was the goal to prevent communism from spreading? To protect South Vietnam? To achieve military victory? With no clear endpoint, victory became undefined and unattainable. In time, body counts replaced strategic progress, and military success became detached from political reality. Lesson 4. Public support matters. The Vietnam War unfolded during the rise of television. For the first time, Americans saw combat footage almost daily. Images of wounded soldiers, burning villages, and flag-draped coffins shaped public opinion in ways no previous war had. When support collapsed, so too did the ability to continue the war. Leaders learned that sustaining public trust was essential to any long-term conflict. Lesson 5. Healing takes more than time. Even decades later, the Vietnam War continues to influence how countries remember, how they treat veterans, and how they approach future conflicts. The emotional and psychological wounds remain. But so too does the opportunity to understand, to listen to veterans, to study the past honestly, and to honor all those whose lives were forever changed. The Vietnam War may have ended in 1975, but its resonance has never truly faded. Decades later, its memory lingers not just in monuments and museums, but in conversations, families, books, and quiet moments of reflection. Across the world, people still ask, what did it all mean? In Vietnam, life has moved forward. Children who were born after the war now walk through cities filled with cafes, scooters, and smartphones. Foreign investors build factories. Tourists wander ancient temples and sunlit beaches. Yet in the countryside, war cemeteries line quiet roads, and elders still carry memories etched deep into their hearts. In the United States, the war became a crucible, one that tested the nation's ideals, strained its unity, and reshaped its politics. It taught generations to question power, to seek truth beyond headlines, and to value the voices of those who serve and suffer. But more than anything, the Vietnam War revealed something fundamental about the human condition: the capacity for endurance and the profound cost of misunderstanding. There are no neat conclusions, no final judgment that can fully encompass the scale of what happened. For every soldier who served with honor, for every protester who marched for peace, for every family who waited for a loved one who never came home, Vietnam was personal. The war showed how easily people and governments can be drawn into conflict, how hard it is to get out, and how vital it is to ask the right questions before taking the first step. Today, veterans from both sides sometimes meet, not in anger, but in recognition. They speak of shared burdens, of time lost, of memories too sharp to forget. In quiet cemeteries in America and Vietnam, flowers are placed, tears are shed, and moments of silence speak more than any words could. From the jungles of the Mekong to the marble walls of Washington, D.C., from Saigon's vibrant streets to rural American towns where sons never came home, the Vietnam War has left its mark. And now, as this story comes to an end, we are reminded of the simple, enduring truth. Peace is precious, understanding is powerful, and history, though often painful, is worth remembering, so that its lessons are never lost.